Welcome to the Washington Heights Church podcast. We're so glad you're here. Each week, we bring you the latest Sunday message filled with God's Word to help strengthen your faith and deepen your walk with Christ. Whether you're tuning in from home, your commute, or anywhere in between, we're thrilled to have you join our community. So, grab a cup of coffee, find a cozy spot, and let's get started.
Living the Dream is what we've entitled this series, looking at the life of Joseph in the Old Testament. And we began by saying that he received the dream. It wasn't his own dream, it was a dream that God gave him. But if you have been with us to this point, it's played out more like a nightmare because he's had one bad thing after another happen to him. But today, we're going to see the tables turn. And we're going to see success come Joseph's way. And here's a question that we've been asking all along the way, and we're going to ask it again today. What do I do when I don't know what to do? And as we see the tables turn and success be handed to Joseph like on a silver platter today, maybe we'll put this nuance along with that question. How do I handle my success? Now, here's my guess at your response to that, where you're like, hey, I get that I could use some help and some hope in the middle of adversity, but not in success. I understand why, I would look for, God's lifeline when I'm struggling and all of that. But when it comes to success, I got it. I know what to do with that. But I want to suggest to you as we begin today, success is good. But it could be that in moments and times of success, that we're tempted with something that is so subtle and hard to discern that might cause us to trade the dream that God has given for us for something that's okay, but is not the best and is not the greatest. And so let's see how that plays out in Joseph's life because he navigates that really well. Well, here's where we've been in Joseph's story so far. Here's kind of the pain index. He's hated by his brothers because he's favored by his father, and they throw him into a pit. Eventually, they sell him into slavery. He gets falsely accused of rape in Egypt. He gets sent to prison, and he's forgotten for years. And when we left off the story last week, we left Joseph in prison where he had just helped two guys out by interpreting their dreams. And he asked one of the guys that he helped, hey, when you get reinstated to your position in the palace and you were the cupbearer and you will once again give Pharaoh his cup, would you remember me? But he's forgotten. And 2 years go by where Joseph continues to sit in a prison cell. And that's where we pick up the story today. Genesis 41, verse 1. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. And Pharaoh woke up and he's like, these are the Walking Dead kind of cows out there, who are consuming these other ones. And he's disturbed by that dream. And he fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted thin and scorched by the east winds. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and the wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told him his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Hey, you know what? I forgot something 2 years ago. I was in jail with a guy, and you need to meet this guy. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dream, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position. The other one, not so much. The other man was impaled. So Pharaoh, there's a guy who's got this skill with dreams. You should get him. And so that's what Pharaoh does. And he summons Joseph, who's still in a prison cell. He's cleaned up, brought before Pharaoh. Pharaoh shares his dreams with him. And then Joseph does what God gifted him to do. And he interprets those dreams. And he says, you had two dreams, but really they're the same dream. Because what you see first is that there are going to be 7 years of bountiful harvest. And there's going to be so much growing. But after that comes 7 years of famine. And God's told you what he's going to do. God has revealed to you what is about to come. And then so Joseph suggests, a plan. Well, so what are you supposed to do with that? And he suggests what might be the first food co-op in recorded history, where he says, hey, in the 7 years of bountiful harvest, why don't you set aside 20% of the crop so that you have a lot in reserve for the years when there is famine. And what does Pharaoh do in response to that? Pharaoh says the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and all his officials. And so now when you're in charge and been presented with a good plan, you need somebody to carry out that plan. So who's going to do that? Pharaoh asks him, can we find anyone like this man, Joseph, in whom is the Spirit of God? He recognizes that there is something supernatural happening in what has just been revealed to him. And so all of a sudden, Pharaoh just turns to Joseph and he says, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Well, that's a turnaround, wouldn't you say? The guy who went from the pit to Potiphar as a slave into prison is now in the palace with Pharaoh, holding a lot of power. And you could look at Joseph's story and, you could in essence say it's from prison to the palace in about 20 minutes. That's a quick turnaround. Now, here is what I think we could do with this story, especially in America, in our culture. We could go something like this. This is the payoff moment for Joseph. He struggled so much, but now look at him. And we can, kind of teach this story this way, where we could say, hey, and have you had people who have opposed you and hated you like his brothers did? Yeah, I've had people oppose me and not like me. And have you gone through some difficult circumstances? Yeah, I've gone through some difficult circumstances. Well, you hang in there and you stay true to your values and God's values. And you know what God's going to do someday? He's going to elevate you and promote you and reward you. And I want to suggest to you that is not the lesson of this story. Not here and now. Well, why not? Because there's a much bigger story playing out. A story that if Joseph gave in to that idea of saying, you know what, this is good as it gets. You know why? Because it's going good for me. He would have missed the bigger story, the promised story of God that was playing out the entire time. But Joseph is going to stay on track, and he's going to live out his life in the backdrop of God's story that is much bigger than his own. And it includes him, but it isn't about him. And his life has value, and every life here has value. But we have the opportunity to live our lives in the backdrop with God's story the entire time. Or we can look to times of success and to think, this is as good as it gets because it's going good for me. So let's see how Joseph did that. How do I handle my success? We're going to look at 4 things. We're going to look at the first 3 really fast, and then we're going to spend some time on the last one. So how do I handle my success? First, with humility. And that is an ongoing realization that in times of success, I did not get here by myself. And there's so many Olympic athletes right now, and in the interviews that you see with them, how many times do they talk about their parents and a coach and so many people who believed in them and supported them? They did not get where they got all by themselves. There's an image I came across a number of years ago. It's always stuck with me, and I want to share it with you because I think it's this exact same point. And it looks something like this. It's a turtle on a fence post. Now, what do you know when you see a turtle on a fence post? And the great writer Alex Haley said this, you know that he had help, right? He didn't get there by himself. And in times of success, you and I, we are turtles on a fence post. We didn't get there by ourselves. And Joseph remembered that. Right, there's that part of the story where Pharaoh has a dream. Joseph is now brought in, and Pharaoh says, hey, I hear that you can interpret dreams. How easy would it have been for Joseph to say, yep, I'm your guy. I'm the dream guy. This is what he said. I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. He knew that God had gifted him. It wasn't his inherent skill, but it's an ability that God gave him. And in this moment, speaking to somebody who thinks he is God in human form, because that's who they believe Pharaoh was in Egypt, he says, you don't need a guy, you don't need me, you need God. You need the God of the Bible, because he can do what you're asking. But what a moment of opportunity to take credit for himself. But Joseph doesn't. He stays humble and realizes, I didn't get here by myself. How do I handle success? Second thing is diligence. Be faithful where you are. So Joseph proposes a plan. Let's set aside food for the lean years. And Pharaoh says, go. And what does Joseph do? He goes to work. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it up in the cities. And day after day, what does Joseph do? He gets up and goes to work and carries out the plan. He is faithful to where he is. Sometimes in times of success and promotion, when we have leadership responsibility, it can be easy for us to think, you know what? That's kind of beneath me now. I'm the exception because I'm a leader. And I would suggest to you that Joseph and so many other places in the Bible tell us leaders are to be the example and not the exception. And so he is faithful where he is day after day. He goes to work and he carries out the plan. We're not bigger and better than that. How do I handle my success? There's also the opportunity for growth, to get your heart healthy. When you think about what Joseph has been through, right? Betrayed and sold off by his family, falsely accused and all of that, isn't that ripe ground for somebody to develop some bitterness, some anger, some hostility, some desire for vengeance? But Joseph doesn't do that, because a lot of success is not just external. And how easy would it be in his life to say, hey, you're now second in charge, and be seething with all of those negative emotions inside because of what he has been through. But he took the time in his season, even of success, to grow his heart healthy. Where do you find that? Well, Joseph is second in command. He's riding around the chariot where they say, hey, make way because Pharaoh's appointed one is coming. People bow the knee to Joseph. He's riding around in Pharaoh's Bentley chariot, and people respect him, because of his position and power. He's given an Egyptian wife, and in that relationship, they have 2 sons, and here's what he names his first son. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, and he said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. Manasseh is a Hebrew name. And Manasseh sounds like, in the Hebrew language, like the word forget. And what he's saying is, all that stuff that I've been through, I'm going to paraphrase what he calls his son, I let that stuff go. I let that stuff go. And he's not denying what he's been through. He's not trying to live in some imaginary world, but he is saying, you know what? I've dealt with some of that. You know what I've done? I've let it go. And I'm not going to be defined by my circumstances that have brought me to this point. Instead, he holds on to a Hebrew name. Joseph, why in this moment, when you have everything in Egypt, you've been rejected by your Hebrew people, and here you are in Egypt, and people are bowing down to you, and you've been given an Egyptian wife. They even gave you an Egyptian name. Why would you not name your son an Egyptian name? And here it tells us he's holding on to the promise of God that he has made to his people, a covenant people. What does that mean? A covenant is a promise that God has made. And to his great-grandfather, Abraham, one day God said, through you, I will bless all the nations of the earth. And so with all the success happening around him, Joseph holds on to the promise of God because he is one of the covenant people, and so he names his son with a Hebrew name. His other son he names Ephraim, and that sounds like fruitful. And he's saying, you've made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And do you catch that? He's not saying, this is as good as it gets because it's going really good for me. He's saying, no, this is the place of my affliction. But God has made me fruitful here. And so what you begin to see is Joseph is not looking to be defined by his circumstances, bad or good. Instead, he's holding on to a promise that God has made. And a promise handed down through their generations, and now he carries that torch. And really that leads us into the final way to handle our success, and that is perspective. And to understand that my story is part of God's bigger story. See, we might think, when things go well for me, that's it. I made it. I crossed the finish line and I got to the apex, the payoff, the reward of what my life is all about. But Joseph says, no, there's something bigger happening. And let me sketch that out for you really fast. What is the bigger story? You go all the way back to the beginning of Genesis and you see God create this perfect world and put a man and a woman in there, and he gave them the ability to choose. And one day they decided, God's keeping something from us, so we're gonna follow our own way because we think it'll go better for us. We will be like God. Well, what happened on the other side of that decision, theologians often refer to that as the fall. There was nothing good that comes out of the fall. Relationship with God was severed. Relationship with each other was severed. The earth was broken, and that's why we have so many of the things that we have. You and I right now, we live on Earth 2.0, the one after the fall. But in that moment, God shows up and he makes this promise, this covenant. And he says, I'm going to put enmity between your seed, the woman's seed, and the seed of God's adversary. And really, in one respect, the rest of the Bible is that promise playing out. And then God shows up a couple generations later to Abraham and says, one day your seed is going to be greater than all the stars you see in the sky. Well, that's interesting because at that point, he and his wife are really old. And they're past the whole child thing, and they don't have any. But God miraculously shows up and he begins this nation. And one generation after another, and Joseph is in that line. And how easy would it be for us to think, well, this must all be pointing to Joseph being a part of the fulfillment of that story, because as a nation grows, eventually it will produce one who one day comes. And the promise way back at the beginning was, you will bruise his heel, but he will crush your head. God's adversary. And along comes Jesus, and one day, when he is nailed to a cross, his heel is bruised. But on the cross and walking out of a tomb, he crushes the head of God's adversary and throws open the doors to a relationship with God. And we may think, well, this is Joseph's part in that story, right? Because it must be through his line, but it is not through Joseph's line. And what Joseph is going to see is that when his brothers show up one day, he's going to have the opportunity to make it clear to them. Because just as God said, all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because of those 7 years of famine, because the famine was severe everywhere. You know who's included in everyone coming? Joseph's brothers. Now, what is it going to be like for those brothers to stand before the one that they sold off into slavery, who said, I had a dream that you're going to bow down to me. Yeah, we don't like that dream. We're going to get rid of you. We're going to try to kill the dream. And in trying to kill the dream, they actually fulfilled the dream. And so when they show up in Egypt and they recognize and they come to understand this is Joseph that we are seeing now, and they begin to feel the noose tighten around their neck, because what is he going to do out of retribution for what we did to him? And you know what he doesn't say to them? He does not say, I told you so. I had a dream and you were going to bow down to me and other people were going to bow down to me, and here I am. You tried to get rid of me, but here I am, large and in charge in Egypt, and man, do you have it coming. Now you would have said that, right? And you know how I know you would have said that? Because I would have said that. I mean, that's just human nature. But you know what Joseph says? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. God sent me here to save you. To save you. And ultimately to save the nation that would one day produce the one who would bless all the nations of the earth. God sent me here. And again, it's not even Joseph's story and line through which that would come, because when the brothers come, one of his brothers is named Judah, and Judah's a bad dude. When they came up with the idea to sell him off into slavery, it was Judah who said, yeah, let's do that to him. Judah's a bad man. But then when he shows up, Joseph does this thing where he's testing them and he wants to keep the youngest brother. And then Judah, for the first time, as far as we understand it, says, no, don't keep my youngest brother here because it will kill my father back at home. Let me stay, let him go. And for the first time you see somebody saying, let me be his substitute. And many, many years later, Jesus, who is given many titles, one of those titles is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, becomes the substitute for all of us. And we see that pictured there. And Joseph holds on to the promise that God has made, that his life matters, but his life is a part of God's story and where God is taking all things. And so Joseph in this moment, isn't this story about you? No, he says, no, I was brought here. God brought me here so that Judah could be saved, so that the nation could be saved, so that one day God's promise will come true. And here's what I would suggest to you. Does it get better than when our life is going really good? Success is good. It is. But the best thing is when our valuable lives are lived as part of God's bigger story, because he is still doing what he has been doing for so long. And that promise-keeping God is still doing so many things. Why do we continue to gather? Why do we study? Why do we learn? Why do we understand? So that our lives more can be a part of God's bigger story. And you and I have been invited to attach our lives to God's bigger story. And in seasons of success, that's a good thing. It really is. But the temptation is in those moments that we can lose sight and make the ultimate thing, especially in a culture like ours right now, that the highest and best thing is me, myself, and I. And I would say to you, you're valuable and your life matters. But it isn't about you. Not ultimately. It includes you, but it isn't about you. And so our lives can be joined with the story of God and the promises that he is still keeping. So in seasons of success, stay humble, be diligent, get your heart healthy, but have the perspective and see the opportunity to live your life in harmony with God's big story. That we would join God in what he's doing because we were made for that. So let me ask you this question as we wrap this up today. What would you do if you knew that God was with you? What would you do? And that's a question that applies to times when we're in the pit and in the prison, and where it feels that way. It also applies when we're in the palace and life is really good, because the truth of Joseph's story is God was with him the whole way, and it's true for you as well. So what would you do if you knew that God was with you? Would you pray together with me? So God, thank you for who you are and all that you are doing. God, you are the promise-making and promise-keeping God. And to think that you have stepped down into this real world of ours and you are still at work in so many ways. God, forgive us for the times that we think that all of this is ultimately about us. Thank you for involving people like us and allowing our stories to be a part of your story. And so God, wherever we might be today, down, low, or up high, or somewhere in between, God, help us to know there's a bigger picture, bigger than us. And it's ultimately what we were made for. It's to join you in the things that you are doing. And there's no better place to be. And so we pray that you would give us the kind of faith to see what you see and to join you. And we ask and pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.
We hope you enjoyed today's message. If you found this sermon meaningful, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your support helps us reach more people and spread the word. Stay connected with us throughout the week by following us on social media at Washington Heights Church on Facebook and Instagram, and by visiting our website at whc.faith. For more information and additional resources, check out the podcast description below. Thank you for joining us. See you next week.